All right, good morning. We're going to get started again with our first panel of the day on protocol objectives and eligibility. And so please welcome my fellow moderators, Scott Berry, and panelists. And I'm going to start with just having each of the panelists introduce themselves quickly.
You did?
I'm Scott Berry. I did this already.
I'm Joanne Donovan from Catabasis. I'm Chief Medical Officer there.
I'm Mike Panzero, Chief Medical Officer of Wave Life Sciences.
Hank Meyer, I'm a pediatric pulmonologist in the neuromuscular field, Philadelphia.
Just got here in time. Paula Clemens, I'm a neuromuscular neurologist.
I am Gretchen Egner. My son Nick has Duchenne.
So great, we'll get started. So there's a lot of information that was presented to everybody this morning. So we're going to start with some of the overall goals and objectives of the protocol and the eligibility criteria. So you heard that the goal of this platform trial is really transformational for patients. Our aim is to create a platform trial that will improve drug development, improve regulatory science decisions, and improve, probably most importantly, improve the landscape for patients. The success depends on the confluence of all three of these goals. If the platform is not attractive for patients, drug companies, or regulators, it will not be successful. So I want to start with the first question, just go down the line, actually I think Hank is going to start us off here. Do you believe that the platform trial meets these goals?
Yeah, I think it's very exciting and encouraging to have an opportunity for patients to have a smooth conduit into intervention studies. And I don't want to speak from the perspective of a parent because we have somebody here better equipped, but from a clinician and seeing parents and patients struggle over what study to join and at what time, and if they can strategically wait and still be eligible. Just seeing the angst involved in that, and I think removing that, it would be a tremendous benefit. And then the efficiency of actually recruitment and getting data is a huge benefit.
No, I guess I'll. I think there are a lot of, clearly, as we heard, a lot of potential advantages. There's also a lot of the practical logistics and those things that would have to be worked out, but logistics by definition are surmountable. You can do things to sort of fix those. You can do things to help in that regard, and I think as we go through the conversation, the panel conversation, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I do think, if the goals are as stated here, I think it's getting there. I think they're probably, that's part of this meeting, is to try and make sure that we can fully attain those goals.
The goals are, it would be hard to argue with any of those goals. They are unassailable. And the hard part is figuring out how to implement that. And we know that one of the limitations has been the number of patients that come into clinical trials. And you spoke before about oncology studies in kids, where almost all of the kids are enrolled. And the limitation for most of the studies that are ongoing is getting patients into the study and enrolling, because usually that takes the longest part of the study. So if we can encourage participation because of the positives of going into another trial afterwards, and also relieving, some parents are going to see the choice not as an opportunity, but as a burden to making a decision between trials. So I think that's a question out there of how the community, view this.
I think when we entered, my son Nick was on the Adalurin trial. He's still taking it, but he started in 2006. And it was just, is there something out there that my son could take? And then you pin all of your hopes on that one therapy. And the way we've done trials currently, you're in it and you're hoping that it works and you really don't know. But if the FDA comes back and doesn't approve it, it's almost like the FDA's fault as opposed to the fact that the drug wasn't viable. And I think anything that's going to reduce that time of waiting, and you have a midpoint where it's not like the end for my kid because he can wash out and try something else. And it kind of points to us all being on the same team and all looking for that common goal.
And I think, the overarching goal is to move things forward in terms of treatments for Duchenne patients. And I think back to like 20 years ago, and we talked about how, the way to move that forward is to get more engagement, more people involved. And it does seem like this has that opportunity. And that's not an opportunity that we have as a one-by-one.
So if we could dive into the patient perspective and thinking about that. So there's several features of this. One is ambulatory and non-ambulatory patients, the 3-to-1 randomization, the open label extension if an arm is successful, or the potential re-randomization. The one other aspect that may be different from a patient perspective is the randomization across appendices. Do you think those things combined together is attractive for patients?
Definitely. Currently, if you have a trial, if you have a son who's non-ambulatory, you're hoping that that drug will get through the trial process so it gets approved so that your child can take it. And so having that access to the drug, if it is working, they get it faster. For the randomization, the reduction of number of patients on placebo, that slide that you showed that had the actual numbers, that seemed very positive to me. I am interested more in the talk. Dr. Dunn spoke of the bright light on the placebo to not placebo. But I think if you have drugs that you see that they aren't working right away, a patient might not even know that they're on placebo. They get washed out and it's randomized and maybe it's not an issue. But I think that speeding up of time and then knowing, does it work, not work? To me as a parent, I think that's very valuable and worthwhile.
Anybody else? Anybody else on this question? Yeah. Some of the specifics?
I'm curious in a way. One of the things that was alluded to is that while we can't pick winners in terms of which trial might be better, which might have greater chance of success, you do give up that ability to choose which trial, because we heard in a wonderful talk this morning the research and the thinking that went into Beth's decision about which trial. For the benefits that you've mentioned, how do you feel about that sort of cost, if you will? Because there are going to be different frequencies of administration, different risk profiles in that pool. How does that feel to you?
I think if we magically knew the drug would be approved already and we'd know it worked, but we really don't know. And I appreciate that. When, Nick has the premature step, and so in 2001, he was so lucky that he had the premature step. And when I see things happening with gene therapy and the exon skipping, you have to be amenable to something in particular. But Duchenne is so complex, and things could work pulmonarily, cardiac. I mean, there are so many factors, and we just don't know. People will say, Nick's been on Adalurin for 12, 13 years off and on. Is it working? Well, I don't know, but he seems to be doing okay. He seems to be stable. He hasn't been assessed with endpoints in a really long time. And so one of the things I love is that about this protocol is that you would be analyzing that data and looking at that data. And maybe if PTC hadn't been thinking, hey, let's look at X to see if that's working. Maybe in another thing, that data is being collected, and we weren't looking for that, but hey, look, here's how it's helping your son. And I think that, again, it's just invaluable for our community.
I guess this question was actually more directed at drug sponsors, but I think it's actually interesting to think about it from the patient-parent perspective. And when I hear you talk, I hear really a significant maturity in terms of dealing with Duchenne and clinical trials and whatnot. And it occurs to me that it's those of you who are further along in this pathway who will, I imagine you couldn't have said those words 12 years ago, and, so there's a whole mentoring and educational process that will come along with that.
So like the next question, like many things in life, it's a big equation. You're always calculating what you got to put in and what you're going to get out. And I think this next question is directed at the sponsors. So do you think that on balance, agreeing to enroll within the master protocol and the loss of controlling the inclusion-exclusion criteria and what you're getting, the potential accelerated time to first patient in, the sharing of placebo arms to improve power, and the sharing of infrastructure to reduce costs. Do you think that on balance this is attractive for you? And this is mostly directed at the sponsors, but I appreciate hearing from everybody.
I think that the devil is going to be in the details here, because you are enrolling a much broader population. That is great long-term in terms of being able to go to FDA with a larger patient population, with information on the older population that perhaps isn't getting acquired in some of the other studies. That will come at a significant cost as well in terms of the costs of doing the study. So that needs to be balanced, and we need to see how that sorts out. It potentially could be cost neutral or better, but I think it's going to be really important for sponsors to be able to make that case concretely, because those of us in our development role often are going to need to talk to other people at the company and make that case that it will be faster than we could do on our own, or and cheaper, or at least cost neutral. And I think that we'll sort through that out. Another issue is drug availability. Instead of a smaller group for the study with a narrower age population, you have to provide drug, which has a cost to the larger population. So there's a number of things to be worked out.
I'd agree with that. I think some of the other, one of the questions was about the inclusion-exclusion criteria. I wasn't as concerned necessarily seeing that here, simply because there's that provision that the appendices can have exclusion criteria, because every drug has potential risks. And obviously that means there are certain patients who, based on their health status, may not be appropriate. So as long as those can be added into the exclusion criteria to ensure patient safety, then I think that is workable. So controlling inclusion-exclusion criteria, I don't see that as important. Although, to Joanne's point, that could make the study bigger and more cost that way. So that would have to, of course, be balanced. I think sharing of infrastructure to reduce costs. Again, that's going to be in the details. I mean, there's a lot of what we do that isn't simply site infrastructure. It's the monitoring of data, it's the transferring of data, it's all of those things that people don't even know about, really, that have to happen in order to get those data to the regulatory authorities to do their assessment. So that whole back end would have to be really looked at, and to make it attractive, to how that would work. I mean, every sponsor has their own, either internal monitors or CROs, and how does that work? How does a physician know what study they're working in, so they make sure they don't draw an extra blood test on somebody or administer the wrong placebo for a given study? There's just those types of just logistical details that'll have to be worked out. And then we often talk at a lot of these forums about FDA. I mean, my job is to make sure this can get approved around the world. Every regulatory authority is going to have an opinion on this. So how we apply this to global approvals, particularly in Europe, other jurisdictions, that'll also be something important to us, because we can't, even though we have an infrastructure that appears to support a U.S. approach. If that doesn't support a global approach, it doesn't become an attractive infrastructure to leverage. So those are the things that we would have to think about.
Hank or Paula, do you want to pretend to be a sponsor for a little bit?
I guess my comment is more related to sort of target population. We talk about ambulatory versus non-ambulatory, and obviously as a pulmonologist, I tend to think more about different stages in pulmonary decline, and having patients that are either in the early stage of pulmonary decline or patients where the vital capacity or the peak flow hasn't begun to decline versus patients who are in the rapid, fairly stable decline, where an intervention should show could show a significant improvement relative to the earlier cohort where there's very little decline, where it'd be very much more difficult to show an improvement. The other issue that I think is still underappreciated and unsolved is what I consider the primary and most important pulmonary outcome, which is hypoventilation or respiratory failure, and we don't yet have good criteria for that. And that's something that hopefully will change over time and may be able to be integrated in a future iteration.
I guess the only comment that I would make is from the standpoint of being involved as a study chair in sponsored multi-center studies, and really playing off of your comments on that whole back end piece. And it already seems pretty complicated to put all the pieces together, and now I think this one of the things that we will have to deal with, kind of in the weeds part of this, was you would have to actually have an entire another layer, which means a whole nother layer of communications between bodies, because clearly the sponsors need to keep a strong hand in just the management and the monitoring, et cetera. So I think that's actually going to be a significant piece of the infrastructure that has to be built.
And I think you alluded to something that I think that I'll also comment on is one of the things, and as I've been doing this for many years, is one of the most important aspects of being able to execute a successful study or get it done quickly is making sure that you're very engaged with, of course, the patient community, but also scientific community, which means engaging experts in your particular compound, your particular mechanism. And the amount of work that expert then has to put into the entire process to get you to trial is enormous, and I would want to make sure, and they do that because, of course, they care about the community, but also because for academic advancement. So we would have to just make sure that, although this will have its own governance, that those principal investigators who put so much work into getting studies off the ground, you alluded to doing that, which is why it came to my mind, is make sure that that's allowed to be incorporated into that governance oversight in an effective way to enable investigators to want to participate. Because in my experience, it's that cool scientific mechanism, that creative clinical trial, but also that academic pursuit that motivates to keep people involved. I want to make sure we include that.
And I think that what you have represented here are people from companies that are well into the clinical trial process. I think another potential advantage is to bring other companies that may have a compound that looks promising, but it's on the shelf, and bring that, because you have a ready-made ability to turn basically the compound over to the platform trial and move it forward. So it has the potential for bringing other sponsors in than are currently in the development area.
Yeah, and there's no reason NIH couldn't put a drug in. There could be a fund that takes repurposed drugs that come in. I mean, it could be a wide range of sponsors, actually, that come into it. thinking about, I don't necessarily want you to put your regulator hat on. We heard from Dr. Dunn. I mean, the fact that Dr. Dunn was here, Janet Woodcock was here, is they buy into this. But thinking about the standardization of endpoints, the ambulatory, non-ambulatory, the common data analyses, the multiple modes of administrations of placebos, thinking about the scientific information coming out of this for regulators, for academics to move the field forward. Does this seem like a positive thing?
Well, so to your point, I think I've learned over the past 18 years not to speculate what regulators think, especially when they're sitting in the room. So actually, I've learned that several times in this room. So it seems like a common place to have these conversations. So I would say that what I can comment on is, though, the types of things that in my experience have led to those smoother interactions, those smoother reviews, and some of the focuses, and I think you heard of some of this alluded to today. Quality data, making sure you have very strong data that is able to stand up to scrutiny and analyses and access to that data. The training that you put in place to make sure that there is a consistent training on these endpoints across the board. These are very subjective endpoints, and that requires good training, it requires good monitoring, and it requires strict adherence to GCP, a good clinical practice. All of these things are going to be very important for when the data get to the point of usability for supporting the approval process. We heard about historical controls and all the issues with those, and making sure that, you know, this trial, and as it's going in perpetuity, is going to have historical data sets and placebo groups of different ages, right, as time goes on. At the beginning, they'll all be similar ages, but as you go on, you'll have different time elements from the protocol. It's going to be very important that that's done in a way that can be applied for regardless of the assessments being done. So I think in the whole context of usability of data, ensuring quality, making sure you have that usability, otherwise it's all for naught. You'll get to the end, the data will not be of a quality that can be applied to the process, and you've lost in the end. And I alluded to this just very briefly earlier. Don't underestimate that when you have all these logistics for the potential for the best sites with the best intentions still to make mistakes. Yeah. They're going to be juggling a lot of different protocols. Is this, what group is this in? And little errors happen. Actually, patients get the wrong drug, potentially, and that'll all have to be watched out. Again, strong monitoring, good data quality, strict adherence to GCP, and how you verify all of that.
We, of course, hope that less happen in this, but proof's in the pudding for that, for sure.
Yeah. And I think there's more. We heard years ago about the 6-minute walk test being done completely differently at different sites, or by different sponsors, rather. So eliminating the problem where we have a different protocol for doing one of these assessments, that everything is done the same across the site, I would think would make the life easier for the sites and improve the quality of the data.
So when we had a prep call with these kind folks where we talked a lot about the protocol and different issues, and one thing that came up in that call, and I think you've all saw today, that there's a two-step randomization process. And so we're wondering, and I think sort of trying to recapitulate a little bit of what we talked about, do you envision, so the randomization of patients to different appendices, do you envision pushback in the two-step randomization process where patients are randomized to appendices they are eligible to, and then after that, the second step being randomized 3-to-1 active to placebo?
Yeah.
So, Paula, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I'll be interested to hear what, sort of the patient-parent perspective is, because I think that's going to be the key one. I think, to me, from an investigator standpoint, it seems like just part of the logistic that, and will likely be relatively seamless, that's obviously important, that you have to become eligible for the platform before you can then be tested for eligibility for one of the protocols. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, just as I said before, like in the trials that we have going now, they're in placebo and they get randomized and put in placebo. So there's a reduction in the total number, and that time is shorter potentially because you'll find out sooner if something isn't working, and then you can get put back in. So I'm only one parent, but I don't foresee a tremendous amount of pushback because, as Dr. Dunn said, placebo is the gold standard. And so if we're reducing that or making it a shorter period of time, I don't see that as a problem.
So, go ahead.
I was going to ask Gretchen, do you see that different modes of administration, like and just to back up, because I think it took us a long time to get our heads around it. So you're randomized to treatment A, and you will be on placebo or drug for treatment A. You can't quit at that point and then say, no, I'd like a re-randomization so I can go into B, because then that would create different groups. So that person then can't be in the trial if they decline to be in that. And I think that there will be people who are disappointed going into that arm. But where I was going with that was, then if you're randomized to an IV therapy versus PO or subcutaneous, is that an acceptable thing? And that's to Gretchen, yes. You're looking at.
I suppose potentially for some folks, yes, but our bottom line is to save our kids and to improve their quality of life and go through that. And if Nick was amenable to the exon skipping where he had an intravenous thing, he'd get over it, I think. I would be interested in that ongoing arms and things being added in appendices. I suppose if something came down the pike and we were already in, C, and then D comes along and D sounds like the magic bullet, there would be some disappointment. But we're living in a sea of disappointment, and I mean, so I think that's something that it's a hurdle and something that we'd address down the road.
And just by you being in C, you're going to contribute to D getting to the answer faster because of the shared placebo.
Yes, because if we find a combination therapy that works for the kid, then we're all in a better spot, for sure.
And probably that messaging will have to be continually reinforced.
So I'll go off script with a question. Are there things you heard today that if you were in charge of this, you'd make a different decision? Endpoints collected, different decisions on randomization, anything that, thinking about you helping to construct this, and I know you all are, would you do things differently than how we've progressed so far?
Oh, you want to go down the road here?
Joanne?
Okay, I think that one thing that was discussed earlier was the potential for an additional endpoint for a particular study. And so that can go in a specific appendix. But if there is an assessment, say it's a DEXA or something like that, it should also be done the same. Even if it's an optional one, it should be done the same. Now, the next person comes in and wants a DEXA, it's done with a standard process, so you can go over that.
Otherwise, you can share the placebo.
Yeah. So, because I think there will be the desire to have some additional endpoints. That's a great core group of endpoints, but there may be others.
Mike?
No, I think from what I've seen and read, it's a thoughtful process. You've arrived at endpoints that make it usable. You can add more, certainly, but that doesn't help the attractiveness by any means, but either for industry or for anybody who might participate in it. So I think you have a balance of endpoints that you've, I'm sure, discussed a lot, that give the ability that hopefully get that balance of burden versus participation, because I think that I didn't see in the protocol whether there was an assessment of the timing of burden of everything and how much time in the clinic that is. We do a lot of sort of that before we start a study. How long is a family have to spend in the clinic to get these done and without fatiguing the child? So that, I think, has to be done before you really settle on endpoints that you're really comfortable with. Otherwise, again, the word gets around that it's not something you should do because it's too burdensome, then you've sort of undercut your entire operation. So that type of thing. And then some of the other just little things, I think you've done a lot of work, I think, to think about the schedule of assessments and the timings and those types of things. That would have to be looked at again. I feel like you want, again, with the goal of minimizing impact. Lowering the energy required to enter this has to be the top priority. Otherwise, nobody will do it because there'll always be something easier to do where you don't have as much to think about. But I think you've done great already.
Hank?
Yeah, my comment will kind of spill into the third question, which is related to quality control and consistent standard operating procedures for data collection. And I think it's particularly critical because whatever the outcome measure is, whether it's, PUL or looking at ambulation or pulmonary function, you're ultimately trying to find the point when a patient is unable to do a particular technique. And that requires, I think, both the patient trying as hard as he can and then having a tester applying the testing in a way that makes it doable with some encouragement. And I think that requires quite a bit of practice and expertise, and to the extent that that can be standardized, I think the data quality will be much higher.
Paula?
So I had a couple of questions that came to my mind. So the first one that wasn't clear to me from the presentation this morning was, can an appendix protocol limit the age of entry?
Typically not, unless it's mechanism of action, that there's unlikely to benefit that group. What we don't want them to do is do it for power reasons. If one appendix wants all the 6 and 7-year-olds, that's less for others, for example, within that setting, and it's non-comparable across them. So unless it's safety or mechanism of action where that patient is unlikely to benefit, no.
Okay. And then the other question in terms of outcomes that occurred to me is if, let's say Appendix D adds a certain set of biomarkers, then that would that only be collected from the placebos for Appendix D, in which case would it be a lot harder to collect enough data over time that would be helpful in interpreting that biomarker?
Yeah, suppose arm B wants a muscle biopsy for dystrophin level at a particular time period. It wouldn't be collected on controls in other arms as a standard. And that arm coming in, and they can do it on theirs, but they can't request it outside of theirs to be added. Now, as the science goes, we will be adding things for surely. Endpoints will be evolving in the trial, but yes, that could be limited to that appendix.
Okay, and then, but things like serum biomarkers and that kind of thing could be sort of more globally added over time.
Right.
To all arms.
Yeah, blood samples could be collected, analyzed even after the fact, for example.
Okay. I think that's, and then I guess the other, I think this is for, a longer discussion at a later time, but in terms of the physical time function outcomes, it seemed, I at least haven't been part of the discussion yet, other than to evaluate the protocol, and so I'll be interested in that continuing discussion.
I would just say, I don't know that we've come to an agreement on what goes into that front end part of different sites that are going to conduct the trials being streamlined and working together. I think we've talked about how it will take more on the front end to get that done. But we see from site to site to site, just in MD clinics with standard of care, that variability and how that affects our boys and their health. And so anything that improves and increases that communication and gets people talking and collaborating, I think is wonderful.
So I'm going to go off script too. So we've had, if we learned a lot today, if you had one piece of advice to tell us to go back and start working on that tomorrow, so you would be even more convinced that this is the right thing. And, we have clinicians, we have patients, we have a PI, and we have sponsors on this panel, so I'd love to hear your advice for us as we go forth, start working tomorrow. What's the one thing?
I think that the devil is in the details here about how it's going to be recruited, and the cost structure. That's something that, as a company, you just have to know. It's not an option to not know that.
Okay.
I'm going to say three quick things: simplicity, quality, and make sure it's globally applicable.
The last one, say that again, Mike?
Global, has to be global, we have to.
Globally, meaning
outside of the
sites,
United States.
okay.
sites outside of the US?
Well, I think we have to, if the Europeans have a very different view of these types of initiatives than the FDA does. FDA in Europe talk frequently, so that's a great start, is my understanding. Again, can't speak for the authorities, but for us, it's going to be, these are their small number of children available. We don't want to have a different infrastructure, protocol, everything, if we're going to try to get approval outside the United States.
Actually, Scott, has there been examples in oncology where this approach has been accepted in Europe?
We're actually talking to them as we speak on multiple ones. I-SPY is only US. There's a pancreatic cancer and a glioblastoma that are moving into the EU and Australia. So they are becoming global. There are different viewpoints, different experiences in the different countries.
I think standardizing testing with widely agreed upon standard operating procedures would be very important. The other thing in the description was mentioning, thresholds that can be inflection points, such as scoliosis surgery, and the other would be, of course, initiating non-invasive ventilation.
So I think my points would be just streamlining, keeping attention to streamlining and efficiency, but keeping a very open discussion platform with everyone involved.
I'd echo Paula on keeping everyone involved. And I think it was Janet from the FDA who talked about when you're looking at something that's new, you get that pushback as people don't see that it's possible. And to just keep reminding folks that it is possible because they're doing it in other diseases and other areas, and it's successful.
So with that, we have, we actually got back on time. Unless the panelists, you want to make any other comments, we'd love to open it up. And if anybody from the floor has a question or a comment for the panelists, we'd love to take that. And I don't know if we have the mics handy. Ryan, up here, Rasha has a question.
Hi, I'm Alpa Kushalani. The question I have is in connection with what Dr. Donovan said, that since there is two levels of randomization here, let's say a child got randomized to arm A, and for the reasons of the protocol or the administration, the schedule, for that reason, it's not workable for the family, and they choose that they do not want to do that. Do they have an opportunity, say like in 6 months or something, to try to be part of the platform trial again?
Yeah, so if it turns out they're actually ineligible, there's additional tests that happen and they're ineligible, they're immediately re-randomized. If it's patient choice that we decided we don't want to do that, yes, there will be a washout period in the discussion on exactly the timeline of that. There's been 6 months, a year, that the patient can come back after a waiting period and come in during the course of that has certainly been discussed, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Rasha Nibari. I'm a parent of a 6-year-old with Duchenne. So my remark was to Abby. She said, "How would you do this differently?" And I know you weren't asking any of us, but still.
You have the microphone.
Exactly. So one of the things that I feel I struggle with every day is sort of the steep learning curve of entering this world of trials. And I always wish that someone had given me a 101 about trial world. Like, what does it look like? What do I consider? And all the lists that Beth talked about, I think all the parents here have made these lists, pros and cons. None of that, what we put on paper, mattered once we were in the trial, because it's a whole different world of things to consider that we didn't even occur to us. So I think what Dr. Clemens talked about, communication, I think don't forget the parents and don't forget the families in that communication, and bringing them up to speed on what needs to be, what to consider, what are the issues, things like energy levels. Like we're so energetic at the beginning of the trial, and 6 months in, we're exhausted, and that's not something that even occurred to us. So, just that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellen Wagner, and a parent of a child who passed away from Duchenne and actually was in the PTC trial for about 12 years. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is really exciting in that, if I understand this correctly, if you're on an approved drug stable for a year, you're eligible to come in, and that applies to Adalimumab and Exondys 51. Will that apply to additional approvals as we see them in the community? Okay, that's huge. The second question I have is the question about biopsies. So what I understand is if a particular arm requires a biopsy, you wouldn't biopsy the controls of other arms. Mm-hmm. But will the biopsies be done in a standardized form so that if arm A had biopsies done and arm C is requesting biopsies, the control data from A and C could be aggregated and used to better the natural history?
Yeah, I think it's the same as if we added an endpoint. We would absolutely want to do that, for sure, yes.
Great, thank you.
And the intent is if somebody is on stable dose of something that's approved in the future, we would hope that that would become part of the trial, but we don't know. Depends on the kind of therapy and all that, but that's absolutely the intent.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very exciting.
But then to that point, if that is the case, then standardization of biopsy and analysis, standardization of analysis is another element that needs a lot of discussion, because that's not straightforward.
No. Last question, Alan.
One, so lucky.
You are.
I keep coming, this is kind of a sponsor question. Alan Russell, Edgewise Therapeutics. What I keep coming back to is some of these asset-specific exclusion criteria. So I'll give you a hypothetical example. For a scientific reason, your intervention is not compatible with glucocorticoids. Maybe you're going for a replacement strategy. So you're going to have that asset-specific exclusion. I'm just interested in the sponsor opinion on how excited they would be to have that diluted from their phase 2-3 study. So they would lose those patients, really, in their study. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that it goes to stratification at the beginning, that, for example, there are two arms that do not require steroids as a backbone, and then others that require steroids, then that boy would go into just the two non-steroid arms. And conversely, if they're on steroids, they can only be randomized to the treatments that require steroids.
Right. So those,
Yeah.
So if an arm is only enrolling those on steroids, they would only get the randomization of those. But somebody who's on steroids is not restricted to that arm. They would still be randomized across arms, so that company would enroll at half the rate if half the patients were on steroids.
Right.
But they don't get to create exclusivity on anybody.
no, but if it was like an uncommon
Yes.
trait, right? You're
Yeah.
going to basically dilute those patients out from the other assets.
That's right, and that it would give them a different fraction of those patients if that arm is doing that. But they're still equally randomized across it, but they would end up more of one type or less of another type, and hence the stratification and understanding that in the analysis. It would also be an important role of the steering committee to make sure it's scientifically appropriate what's coming in any particular subsets that arm would take in.
I guess I would return to the question to the sponsors about whether they would be okay with that.
I mean, I think there's a detail there that we might not be, or we might be, depending on what we're looking at. I mean, that's one of those details, I think, that we'd have to look at.
Yeah. And I think that the populations of steroid-treated and non-steroid-treated exist, and you're not at a disadvantage, for example, if it's a non-steroid treated, because those are the only kids that you're going to be randomized, even if you had another trial going on. So.
So now we have, I can't say no to Ryan. He made a promise that someone could ask another question. So I promise this, I can't say no. This is the last question.
Get the last word. I'm Russ Butterfield from Salt Lake City. I just had a question about patient flow, and what would the patient experience look like on this trial? To try to understand, for example, if a patient comes on at age 5 and there's not immediately a trial that patient could go into, is there a space where they hold and have PT assessments and other motor function? There's a lot of utility to that, like a natural history arm to the trial almost. Is there a space for something like that where the patient ends up in the platform and then randomizes at a later date into one of the appendices? Is that a part of this? I don't understand the timing, right? Or what if they come off a trial and then there's a period where they're not on an appendix for a while? Do we still follow them?
So we would love for that to be that there's a paired registry that goes with this. As patients are in there from the registry, they become eligible for arms and go back into the registry. Craig's coming up later. He may want to talk about it. We would love that. We're worried if we try to implement that initially, that it becomes a burden to getting started. But this is such a cool idea to have that. Initially, no, but boy, we would love to have it.
Right. Partly what I see is that you might, when you launch, you'll have a lot of interest.
Yeah.
But very little space for new patients.
Yeah.
Right. And so do we have a way to capitalize on that interest?
Yeah, there's an EPAD trial for Alzheimer's where they're doing natural history studies, and the subjects become eligible for the intervention arms during the course of it. They're up to 2,000 patients. So it's the only one I know that there's a platform trial attached to a cohort study. But this is a really cool idea.
Yeah, and maybe just a comment from the sponsors as well. If they had that ready made population to drop into a trial that was already there, already being assessed, is that an upside for you?
Would you be excited if we already had your 150 patients ready to go?
I think that's a yes.
I'd say that works.
Okay, so that was a perfect last comment because, Russ, you painted a picture where demand was greater than capacity. So that's exactly what we're going for. So thank you very much. And thanks to all the panelists.